went to work in Wall Street, and I found that all of the bank analysts had come out of a Marxist tradition. And that was because they were preferred by the banks because they knew that the economy was all about exploitation. And if you go to a business school and take an economics course, you're taught that everybody gets just what they deserve and there's no exploitation at all. And it doesn't make you very practical in understanding how monopolies work and how the world actually functions. The World Bank has always been an arm of the US military. And very often its president has been the former Defense Department head or a military head. The World Bank, upon its founding, had one basic purpose, to make sure that other countries did not produce their own food.
Hello and welcome. Today we have with us the very special Michael Hudson. Michael is professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a researcher at the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College. Michael has authored several books, which should be mentioned in the description box. Michael has also worked as a Wall Street analyst, political consultant, commentator, and a journalist. He is a contributor to the Hudson Report, a weekly economic and financial news podcast produced by Left Out. Michael, welcome to Indian Global Left.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, we have a lot to discuss. We'd take up your classic work, Super-Imperialism, in some detail. We would stop by at Russia and China to discuss a little bit of that before going back to the current state of United States economy. But before that, can we start by asking you about your early background? I was reading up, and your father belonged to a militant Trotskyite tradition, and he got arrested under the Smith Act. So can you describe a little bit of that early background, and if at all it had any influence on your political and economic thinking?
Well, I was born in Minneapolis, and that was the only city in the world that the Trotskyists actually controlled. And they were very influential in the Teamsters Union, the truckers, and the whole Middle West was fairly radical in the 1930s. The governor of Minnesota, Floyd B. Olson, said that he hoped capitalism went right to hell. So most of the people that I knew who were visiting at the house after we moved to Chicago in the 1950s were all left-wingers, and it was quite normal for people to read Marx and have a belief that the government was basically not very fair. And when I went to New York, almost all of the bank analysts, I got a business degree, went to work in Wall Street, and I found that all of the bank analysts had come out of a Marxist tradition. And that was because they were preferred by the banks because they knew that the economy was all about exploitation. And if you go to a business school and take an economics course, you're taught that everybody gets just what they deserve and there's no exploitation at all. And it doesn't make you very practical in understanding how monopolies work and how the world actually functions. So I got along fine with my fellow bank analysts, and we, especially because where the classical the economics that was taught in academia, especially at the Chicago school, assumed that the whole economy works on barter, that everything was just sort of an exchange of goods and services once they're produced, and there was no debt, no financing at all. And working at a bank showed me that the economy was all about finance.
Right. You did your undergrad from Chicago. I wonder if the likes of Milton Friedman, Becker, Stiglitz were there when you were in the undergrad school.
I never went anywhere near the business school. That was across the Midway. That wasn't in the campus as a whole. My degree was in Germanic philology and history and linguistics. and most of my studies, apart from that, were at Roosevelt University in DePaul in music. So it never occurred to me to even read an economics book, and we never met any business school people there. It was just like another world. I was into history of culture, art, and music and literature.
I see. That explains a lot about your mm, use of economic history in terms of understanding economic theories. So let's jump into your book, Super-Imperialism, the Origin and Fundamentals of US World Dominance. So, I mean, very briefly, the thesis explains the rise of the United States, beginning with the interwar period to some extent, but more dominantly during post-Second World War. And you mentioned at least three things, as I picked up, that this new imperial order in the post-Second World War was unique in the sense that there was a single hegemonic imperial power as opposed to a sort of cartel of mafia imperial states in the classical era. And this imperial order involved in an unprecedented manner the use of intergovernmental institutions, which some of which we would take up. And finally, the use of deficit payment in terms of being an imperial state. So these were the three pillars that are very central to your thesis. I was wondering if we could start with your discussion on the World Bank, because I grew up in India in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we were told not by any economist or B school, but it was all over that the World Bank is a very benevolent institution committed to sort of developing the third world. And this had a lot to do with the post-91 reform in India, which started to become hegemonic by then. Your book, on the other hand, shows that the World Bank was directly complicit in restructuring the neo-imperial world order, and particularly its effect on the developing world was terrible. You say that it ignored the agrarian sector, but to the extent that it paid some focus, it in fact suppressed any radical restructuring of the agrarian order, by which you mean land reform, access of rural credit, cooperative, and so on. So can you break down the place of the World Bank in the American-led imperial order for our viewers?
The World Bank has always been an arm of the US military, and very often its president has been the former Defense Department head or a military head. The World Bank, upon its founding, had one basic purpose: to make sure that other countries did not produce their own food. The idea was to have other countries produce goods, food, and services that the United States didn't produce, such as tropical climate crops or plantation crops. And there was an alternative to the World Bank promoted by Morris Forgash, a senator from Florida, for World Bank acceleration. This was fought by the State Department on the grounds that anywhere that there was a land reform, there was a anti-American policy. And the one heaviest element of America's balance of payments was its food exports. And it realized that here was a way to strangle the global South, Latin America, Africa, and what was called the Third World, by being able to cut off its food supply and starve it if it would decide to pursue any policy that the United States did not approve of. It wanted to use food like it's using oil today against Europe, by blocking access to Russian oil, and by invading the Near East to seize the oil of Iraq, seize the oil of Syria, control the pipelines in Afghanistan, and destroy the oil production in Libya. Well, agriculture was what the fight was all about in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s. So I wrote my master's dissertation on the World Bank missions to countries, and all of the missions said you have to promote domestic agriculture, domestic family farming and food production. But the World Bank wrote into its Articles of Agreement that it couldn't do this. The World Bank only made foreign currency loans, mainly in dollars, for projects that would earn foreign exchange. Well, if a country like India or Pakistan feeds itself, this doesn't earn foreign exchange. So feeding yourself did not even qualify for loans from the World Bank. Only if you make export crops or produce things that America wants to import, low-wage manufacturers, will it do it. And I published an article along those lines in a periodical, the Columbia Journalism Review here, and the Catholic Church became one of my major supporters in the years leading up to the publication of Super-Imperialism in 1972, because their liberation theology came out in favor of land reform. And again, the United States said, if there's land reform, then the American corporations can't control the bananas in Guatemala and Ecuador. One of the first regime changes right after Iran was the coup d'etat that the CIA overthrew in the government in Guatemala, which people wanted to feed themselves. And the United Fruit Company said, if they feed themselves, then where are we going to grow our bananas? So again, the World Bank from the beginning was even more destructive of the global South and third world countries than the IMF, because it just blocked any attempt to be self-sufficient, and it loaded down these countries with debt. The projects that the World Bank funded with US dollars and US engineering companies was roads to the export facilities, ports. The World Bank funded infrastructure.
Electricity?
What?
Electricity as well?
Yes, electricity that would serve the American companies there and lower the cost of producing exports for firms that American bought control of. So the world, if American company would buy into a country, the World Bank would supply all of the external costs, so that the company itself, the American company, would not have to build roads, would not have to build port facilities. None of this actually helped the third world countries develop at that time, but they did help the American investment, and it was always looked at that. The idea was to make American investment in foreign countries more profitable, prevent other countries from becoming independent in food, so that if they, for instance, in the 1950s, when China had its revolution under Mao, America tried to starve China by blocking all grain exports to China. Canada broke the blockade and enabled China, fortunately, to obtain its grain elsewhere. But the United States wanted to use that threat against countries, and that's now coming to be very beneficial for the American military today. The Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Foundation says the world population has to drop by 20%. And what they mean is not the white population, they mean the global South population. And they've insisted that countries not buy Russian agricultural exports. Russia has become the main agricultural exporter since the United States tried to starve it and put sanctions against it. And fortunately, the sanctions enabled Russia to actually develop its agriculture and become a major exporter. Well, the United States is trying to prevent Russian grain, as you've seen in Ukraine, from getting to the global South countries, only letting Russian grain be exported to help Europe and the United States, not to anyone outside of NATO. So you have the results of the warped, one-sided development of the World Bank is funded, resulting in today's crisis throughout the global South countries. And it's while these countries are running a balance of trade deficit for their food and energy, they also are still paying the World Bank and foreign bondholders in dollars, where the dollar is going way up against their own currency. So you're seeing a massive kind of default that the United States is trying to use as a godsend to force countries into dependence on another military agency, the International Monetary Fund, which will only make them loans to be able to import the food and the energy they need if they agree to let the U.S. buy control of their infrastructure and complete the privatization takeovers that have been taking place for the last 30 years. So the World Bank is run essentially with a neoliberal economic philosophy strongly by the Pentagon, by the military and the State Department interests as a tool of American economic neocolonialism.
As you spoke about the electricity project, I remember the part of India that I come from. It's right in the what we call the northeast, but is the easternmost part of the country, hilly region. A lot of hydroelectric power projects came up at the behest of the World Bank, and there were huge resistance, I mean, of indigenous people about these big hydel power projects. But then the middle class became very supportive, saying that these are endorsed by the World Bank. Well, they had a reason to do that because power is important for them, because these were urban elites. And you mentioned in your book how the World Bank was structurally in favor of urbanizing projects, and that led to a massive sort of unstable immigration to the cities. One of the striking things that I read in your book is this simple question that why does Chile, a nitrate exporting country, have most of its land not being served with fertilizer, and a country like India with 20% of cattle population have its peasant communities deprived of milk and meat nutrition. That has a lot for us to think about. But
before you get to the next question, let me comment on what you said about the hydroelectric bans. What I found out after I wrote Super-Imperialism and went to work with Herman Kahn's Hudson Institute, a national security institute, was there was a lot of question. Why is the World Bank funding so many dams? Well, that are really not, that cause a huge relocation of population and the electricity to be mainly for the export sector. Well, it turned out that what I was told was that the engineer who designed and was pushing the World Bank dam project had a bedwetting problem when he was a child. And it's like he was working out this bedwetting problem by putting dams everywhere. That's the only explanation we could have for why the World Bank would ever have taken this track to begin with.
Right. So that's the part of establishing of U.S. imperial order vis-a-vis the underdeveloped parts of the world. But the other part is about establishing sort of U.S. hegemony over the developed parts. And Britain was very important because post-Second World War, Britain had, even though it had collapsed, but it had a potential to sort of revive and sort of pose some competition to the United States. And you go on at great length describing that. Would you very briefly tell us some of the pillars of how a sort of British revival through some sort of protection, be that of trade or monetary, was scuttled by the United States, while the United States allowed that for itself, leading to this sort of US hegemony over Europe.
Well, one constant throughout World War II that I've described in Super-Imperialism was the attempt to make sure that England would never be a rival for the American empire. The Americans wanted to absorb the British Empire into the American empire by making sure that this was done by financial reasons, by controlling the balance of payments. It began with the Lend-Lease and later the British loan of 1946 that committed Britain to keep the whole sterling area was not to with its spending on buying British exports, but could buy exports from anywhere. And that meant the United States, which could outcompete with Britain. And also Britain was not permitted to devalue the pound sterling until 1949. And that kept the pound overvalued. And if you, I know it's hard to discuss very briefly finance, but it was a financial manipulation of sterling to destroy its ability to compete with the United States.
Right, yeah. Would you describe a little bit on how United States shifted from a sort of credit-based imperial country, beginning with the Korean War, but more significantly during the Vietnam War, as its war finances went up, it changed from a sort of surplus finance to a deficit finance, and how it sort of miraculously and in an unprecedented way discovered this new way of being an imperial order by still being a deficit country.
Well, that was what led me to publish Super-Imperialism and what made it a bestseller in so many languages. I was a balance of payments analyst for Chase Manhattan Bank in the 1960s. And the balance of payments was something that was not taught in the universities, because if you have an economic theory that says the whole world works on barter, then there isn't any balance of payments deficit, it's all barter. But we could see that it wasn't. The United States, after World War II, the United States emerged in such a strong position that it had most of the world's gold. And from 1945 until 1950, the United States kept drawing in the gold from Europe and other countries. And by 1950, it had over 70% of the world's monetary gold supply. Well, all that began to change with the Korean War. Beginning in 1951, even late 50, the United States balance of payments moved into deficit. And the deficit accelerated during the Vietnam War. And you had a steady gold outflow. So all the money that the United States would be spending on military abroad would end up in the hands of foreign central banks. I did an analysis for Arthur Anderson after I left Chase Manhattan on what really caused the US deficit by doing a statistical analysis. The entire US balance of payments deficit throughout all of the 1950s, all of the 1960s, into the 70s was military spending abroad. The private sector was just exactly in balance. It was the military spending that was sending these dollars abroad. And because Vietnam and Southeast Asia had been French colonies, the banks there were mainly French. And so all the money, the dollars that the Americans were spending in Asia were turned over largely to France, to Paris, and General de Gaulle would cash them in once a month. Okay, here are the dollars, give us your gold. Germany actually cashed in even more gold than France. in many months because it was getting dollars as a result of its industrial export surplus. So these dollars that were spent, the more the America got involved militarily throughout the world, the less gold it had. And we used to sit every Friday, the Federal Reserve would publish the gold cover. In other words, here's the US currency, here's the gold stock, and the US currency by law had to be covered 25% by the gold reserves. But the currency was going up because of the Vietnam War inflation. The gold reserves are going down because of the military spending, and it was obvious that the United States was going to run out of gold, and gold was how it had restructured the international financial system after World War II. The American financial power that gave it the diplomatic power over other countries who all needed money was gold, and the belief was when President Nixon finally had to close the gold window, when there was no more leeway for gold to flow out without threatening gold convertibility, everybody thought, is America's imperialism going to be over? Is this going to usher a new world order, and will Europe and other countries running balance of payment surpluses end up in control? Well, I realized very quickly that that wouldn't happen at all, and that what actually enabled America to create a new kind of imperialism was precisely its going off gold. Because once it went off gold, all these dollars continued to go to the foreign central banks of European countries, of oil exporters, of third world countries exporting raw material. And what were these central banks going to do? Now that they couldn't buy gold, at that time in the 1970s, central banks would only spend their money on buying the bonds of other governments. Well, no other government had as many bonds to issue as the United States, because the United States was running a budget deficit. So it was actually the worse the American balance of payments deficit grew. The more money it spent abroad militarily, the more money, dollars, ended up in foreign central banks that recycled them to the United States by buying treasury securities. So it was actually the balance of payments deficit that was financing the domestic budget deficit and locking into countries into having to support the United States dollar, and with it, the dollar's foreign spending on military basis all over the world, almost 800. And so it turns out that when foreign central banks adopted the treasury bill standard, the dollar standard, instead of the gold exchange standard, it was really the American military base standard. What they were funding, funding with their international financial savings was America's military spending to surround them with military bases. And that was what led the Defense Department and the State Department to say that I've explained to them how a new form of imperialism worked that was much more efficient than the old European colonialism, especially because other countries didn't understand that it was financial. You didn't need to occupy a country, you just need to control its minds and how it thought about the economy to imagine that all of this subsidy of the America's free lunch internationally was all perfectly natural and reasonable.
Right. The whole book is very relatable, particularly I would say to countries of global south, because as you know, in India in 91, they faced the balance of payment crisis. Throughout South Asia now, perhaps not as much for India, but Bangladesh, Sri Lanka's massive crisis recently, Pakistan, but also across Latin America. Countries after countries face the balance of payment crisis. And I mean, people wonder that if you look up, just do a Google search for the United States, it's like $25 billion of deficit, but we can't have a deficit of, let's say, $100 billion, and it's like we become a pariah country, and it's that sort of classic reorientation. I mean, it's unprecedented in history. One question I had in mind is that, which was not very clear from your book, is that what prevented, is it an economic form of coercion, or is it sort of some non-economic political coercion? What prevented these surpluses in the central bank of the surplus countries, non-US surplus countries, to buy back shares of US assets? Because this is what US did, post Second World War. But what prevented that? Because US corporations are like booming as the US government continues to run deficit.
Well, the country who had the most dollars was Saudi Arabia. And I went to a meeting at the White House and met with Treasury officials, and they told Saudi Arabia, you can make as much money as you want from exporting your oil at the higher prices. But if you don't send your money back to the United States, we will look at that as an act of war. You will be dead. You're not allowed to buy any American companies. We can buy other companies, but we don't let other countries do to us what we've done to them. You can buy stocks, you can buy bonds, you can buy real estate, but no major American companies that are important to our own national interest. And in exchange, we will help protect you militarily by putting a base there. And of course, our base is there to protect American military against Saudi Arabia, perhaps doing something that is in its own self-interest. Basically, Saudi Arabia was told, either you send your money back to the US and essentially lose it on bad investments. Saudi Arabia kept buying shares of First National Citibank and keep losing its shirt again and again on Citibank shares because it didn't have good advice as to what to buy, and America would not let it buy anything that actually would make money. Just like with Japan. America told Japan you can buy golf courses and real estate. So Japan bought the land under Rockefeller Center. But then it lost for $1 billion. It lost the whole $1 billion. It tried to buy luxury golf courses in California, lost $1 billion again, because the golf courses regulated what they could charge. So America basically would do to other countries what if other countries did that to America, there'd be war and a regime change there. So essentially that was the mode of financial imperialism was financial, and I had wanted to call my book Monetary Imperialism, but the publisher wanted to call it Super instead. But it's really monetary imperialism, and in order to understand it, you have to understand the balance of payments and central banks and how the world financial system operates, which again is not something that is taught in economics courses in the United States or elsewhere.
Sure. Let's come to the war in Ukraine, but I'd also like you to just give us a brief background about this incredibly cheap privatization in Russia that followed the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Because, I mean, one of the surprising things about Russia is that its life expectancy, particularly of male, but also female, it crashed, I mean, following 1991. And it's very peculiar, because even in the developing world, life expectancy, I mean, it may not be like China, like, you know, going up twice with during Mao's lifetime, but it generally goes up. So give us a brief background of what happened in the 90s and the 2000s, and then I would like to hear your thoughts about what do you feel about the economic interests behind the war that is going on in Ukraine.
Well, in the 1980s, there was a malaise felt in Russia. They realized that the Stalinist central planning just didn't work. It was too centralized. Every economy that's successful is a mixed economy. It's both government and private. If you have too privatized an economy, then you end up with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and a disaster. But if you have too centralized economy without any private innovation, without any private investment, without any market feedback for what people want, that's going to be destructive too. And the Russian leadership realized this isn't working. But they didn't really have an alternative. And one of the problems is that Russia is one of the few countries where nobody's read Karl Marx. There's no understanding of classical economics. And if they would have read Marx's volumes 2 and 3, they'd know that finance capitalism is the final stage of industrial capitalism. But they thought, well, okay, we want to be like the United States. Let's let the United States military and CIA replan our economy. So before there was the wipeout, the privatization, there was a big meeting in Houston of the IMF and the World Bank. And the IMF said, first of all, you have to wipe out everybody's savings. Second, you have to kill 20% of your population. Third, you have to make a crisis and fire everybody, not produce anything, just have a shock therapy. And this was something that usually you have to atom bomb a country to create. But Russia thought that this is what we're being told, we'll do it. They had the same faith in the United States neoliberals that they had under Stalin, and they did exactly what the IMF told them in a public document. You have to have a hyperinflation, wipe out all the savings, and then you sell all of your companies. Well, if you just had a hyperinflation, wiped out all the savings, and turned over the gas company to the management, every factory was turned over to its managers in practice. But who could they sell it to? Because you wiped out the savings. The only people they could sell it to cash out were to Americans and Europeans. And so the Americans came in and they bought all of the companies that were making industrial goods for the military and closed them down and turned them into real estate projects, basically. The Khardakovsky privatized the Yukos oil company and was going to sell it at a huge profit for himself to Standard Oil. In which case America would have ended up buying all of Russia's oil reserves, maybe for $20, $30. I mean, slight exaggeration, but for almost nothing. They would have bought up all the military, and they sent election advisors to interfere with the Russian elections to push President Yeltsin. They sent, basically, Russia's policy was turned over to Wall Street and to the State Department to fund, and it was basically junk economics. Russia was told, don't create your own money. That would be inflationary. You have to base all of your rubles on dollars, and only if you have a dollar equivalent can you issue your own rubles. Well, how is Russia going to get the dollars? Now that it was its industry was all interrupted, it had to sell its raw materials, sell its companies. It was just a total disaster. And the Americans had put in billions of dollars of support for neoliberal groups and for Yeltsin against the Communist Party, until finally, first of all, Primakov was appointed as prime minister, and the United States told Yeltsin, we would look at it as unfriendly if you keep Mr. Primakov there, replace him with somebody else. So he was replaced, I think, by Chernomyrdin, and then he was replaced finally by Mr. Putin, who they thought would be just a supporter. And of course, Mr. Putin was the person who stopped the bleeding and stopped the privatization process for that. So basically, Russia was told, if you could just do to Russia what Margaret Thatcher did to England, you'll be rich in no time. And I went over and gave a number of three speeches before the Duma, saying that even if you've sold, let all of your property be privatized and stolen by the kleptocrats, all you have to do is impose a tax on economic rent. and you will get back what they've taken. You tax the natural resource rent, tax the land rent, and ownership would mean nothing because you would have taxed it away. Well, the politicians who brought me over to the Duma had the Americans manipulated them out of the election and had them removed from the Duma, and so none of that basically occurred. So America had hoped to make Russia into the same kind of satellite that it had made in Latin American dictatorships, for instance. So that it had thought that it had destroyed Russia, and imagine how upset they were when President Putin stopped the bleeding and began to make Russia strong enough, very, very slowly, rebuilding its industry, and especially rebuilding the military, which the United States had sought to destroy. So by around 2014, the Americans said, how are we going to stop Russia from actually developing and becoming a viable, successful economy? Well, the big threat was Germany in all this, because Germany had had its own hopes that when now that there was no longer the Soviet occupation of East Germany, now Germany could export its industrial goods, its consumer goods, its machinery, washing machines, refrigerators to Russia in exchange for getting inexpensive Russian gas. And this was looked at as a threat by the United States because, number one, inexpensive Russian gas would help make Germany and Europe more of a competitor with the United States. So the problem was, how do we destroy the German economy and prevent it from being a competitor? And in the process, how do we wreck the Russian economy so that it cannot develop into a strong enough military power that it could, for instance, join with China and support it? Because ultimately we want to destroy China because China is also becoming more competitive than we are. And if other countries produce their own industry, it's like the third world producing its own food. It's a competition, and America cannot control a monopoly in the industries that other countries develop. And without monopoly rent, that's what imperialism is all about in today's world. So they decided to have a coup d'etat in Ukraine and back the neo-Nazi parties there, fanatic
2014.
Neo-Nazi, the right-wing sector. Yes, yes. And so they had a military coup d'etat, where the military put snipers in the there was a big demonstration, and they put snipers and were shooting their own policemen, pretending that it was the Russians that did all of this. There have been a lot of investigations, and they've all documented what happened. And then basically the right sector, the right-wingers, the neo-Nazis and Thatcherites and neoliberals, who were funded by the United States. Victoria Nuland from the State Department went there and said, we've spent $5 billion funding an anti-Russian, pro-US movement that we call democracy. Other people call it fascism. She said they may have swastikas, but they're democracy because they're pro-US. And if you're pro-US, that's our definition of a democracy. And so they'd basically started, they cut off all pension payments to the Russian-speaking eastern provinces. They began moving up the military and constantly shelling civilian apartment buildings there to try to drive the population away. And it was basically, they were saying the Russian speakers are racially inferior. The Slavic population is racially inferior. We're Europeans, and being Europeans, we want to kill every other race. That's what development's all about. One race has to be supreme, and it's going to be the white race. And that is, of course, democracy, American style. Democracy means you're all white, the rest of the world. As Victoria Nuland said, fuck the EU, when the EU wanted to have a development with Russia. Well, that's how America feels about the global South. And all groups, that Asians, Indians, other people, it was very explicit racism. And that is what finally they said, how are we going to really get Germany not to import all of this new gas that Russia has just built, this new pipeline, Nord Stream #2. What do we do? Well, Victoria Nuland gave a speech. She was still at the State Department under Biden, as she was under President Obama. She said, we've got to make it appear as if Russia's the bad guy. We've got to keep goading Russia to react. We've got to be hurting the East. We've got to kill more Easterners. And if we come in and just begin to murder the civilians, we're sure that Russia can do something. And then we'll say, look at the Russian beast. They're going to invade Europe again, just as they did when they beat the Nazis. But this time we'll tell the Nazis, we've got your back. We're backing you this time, as General Patton and a lot of American generals in 1945. The minute Germany surrendered, America wanted to ally with Germany to have a new invasion with Russia, but Germany was too exhausted at that time. Finally, 75 years later, they said, okay, now we're ready to do it all over again. And they tried to back Nazis with the swastikas and the SS insignias all over again, attacking Russia. And they had thought that this would somehow drain Russia. Every Ukrainian that got shot, at least they used up one Russian bullet. And they said, now Russia will have fewer bullets. There won't be any Ukrainians left, but at least Russia won't have as many bullets or missiles or bombs anymore. And that is, and because the leadership of the right party was given millions and millions of dollars to put in Panama and Delaware and other offshore onshore banking centers, they were essentially acting on behalf of the United States. And all of this was published by WikiLeaks and by others to show, here's all the money that Zelensky and his other Ukrainian kleptocrats have taken abroad. But America said, well, that's democracy. Everybody's making money. What could be more democratic than that? And they had thought that somehow sanctioning Russia would at least deindustrialize Germany, because Germany wouldn't get any more gas or oil or titanium or helium or palladium, anything else that it needed. And Russia, if it was sanctioned, then it would go broke and the ruble would collapse. Well, all Russia had to do was say, okay, we're going to, America and Europe have just grabbed all of Russia's foreign exchange reserves, $300 billion. The Americans and Russia grabbed and said, now Russia's broke. Let's see what it did. Well, Russia said, okay, we will just ask for payment in rubles. And they exported their oil to the whole non-white part of the world that was quite happy to buy Russian oil, Russian food, and the Russian ruble went up instead of down. And the Americans couldn't figure that out. Almost everything the American has done, all of the sanctions have backfired and created the exact opposite of what they had hoped to understand, because they never understood the Russian economy. Just as Russia in 1991 and 1990 didn't understand what capitalism was all about. There was a lack of understanding on both sides. And so the United States cannot figure out how everything that it does trying to hurt Russia only makes it stronger, and not only makes Russia stronger and Europe poor, but it also shows the whole rest of the world, the global South, from Latin America, Africa, India, Asia. It shows this is what the United States wants to do to you. It wants to treat the whole world like it's treating Ukraine, that if it can't control you, it will destroy your economy, like it did that of Libya, like it did that of Iraq, like it tried to do in Syria, This is the American philosophy. We say in English, better dead than red. In other words, we can't control you. You saw what happened in Vietnam. You saw what happened in Laos. And essentially that is how the world is now being split into these two different camps. An aggressive US camp that has at least been able to defeat Europe economically. Europe now, without oil, without Russian gas, without Russian raw materials, and without the Russian market to sell its exports to, is in a state of collapse. Where will they move? I hope you have room in India for the Germans and the French to move into when they find unemployment. I don't know, at least they can, you both, you speak English, and I don't know where else they can move to. That's, the whole world is splitting into something that is unforeseen by the American futurists.
Right. I wouldn't respond because we just have very limited time. I had two questions, but I would just manage to ask one. I would not ask the question on China. I would ask the one on the US. So it seems that the empire, at least since the Second World War, it served its own people to some extent. I mean, not to a great extent, but it served to some extent. I mean, up until the 1970s, because the working class in the US became richer. But if one looks at the last 30, 40 years, the economy, I mean, the aggregate numbers are going up. I mean, stock values are going up, the GDP numbers are going up and up. But the struggle of young people in particular against student debt, housing, car loans and stuff like that, even good real wages. There was a time when, I mean, we were told that United States is one country where workers in the automobile industries would be able to buy automobiles by themselves. I mean, those things have become sort of a distant dream in the post-industrial US era. But all these talks and the bubbles go up and up. So can you just tell our viewers this? Not just a gap between the net asset of the of finance capital and the real economy, but in many ways inverse relation, because if I fail to pay mortgages and loans on housing, and the capitals would buy, and that would lead to speculative trading and stuff like that. I mean, overall value can go up, but I lose up my ability to have a sort of roof on my head. Can you just explain us a little bit on this?
Well, this is what most of my books are about. My Killing the Host and The Destiny of Civilization. Every country emerged from World War II in 1945 almost free of debt. The consumers didn't have very much debt because there was nothing to buy during the war. Businesses didn't have much debt. There was government debt, but not private sector debt. Well, there have been many business cycles since World War II, and each cycle has started from a higher level of debt. Each recovery has been more and more debt burdened. And so what that means is that American families have had to pay more and more of their income every decade, either to rent the houses they live in or to take out a mortgage to buy a house before the rents go up even further. So you have them going into debt for that. America doesn't have public health. So you have a privatized healthcare system that takes 18% of the gross domestic product. You also don't have a public pension program for Social Security. So Americans have to pay more and more of their income to pre-save for Social Security to finance basically the military deficit. The economy now, the average American family, 40% of Americans don't have any money saved up at all. They can't raise $400 in an emergency. And with the COVID spreading here, there's one emergency after another. So you have almost, I'd say 90% of the economy is in debt to the wealthiest 10%. And as a result, the 20% are getting richer and richer and richer. The 90% are getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And even not only is their income going down, but the portion of the income that they can spend on goods and services after spending on debt service and on taxes and Social Security is shrinking. So you have debt deflation. And again, my Killing the Host describes this. It's a concept that happened in the 1930s, when the economy was so heavily indebted as a result of the international situation in the 1920s, that there's really no chance of recovery without a vast write-off of debt. And they're not going to write down the debt in America. The third world countries, the global south, may just repudiate their dollar debt and say there's no way we can pay and import the food and the oil that we need. We're not going to starve in the dark just to pay the American creditors. The debts that the World Bank and the IMF and the bondholders lent us didn't help us develop. They're bad loans, and bad loans should be written down. Not that we're bad debtors, you were bad lenders by making us loans under a junk economic theory that wasn't at all the way that you said the world worked. So the third world can save itself. The United States can't, because there's really no independent party here. There's the Republicans and Democrats are the same party. They have the same campaign donors on Wall Street, and essentially the election process in America has been privatized to the highest bidder. That's all been deemed legal by the Supreme Court. And so the question is, you have America going into a chronic economic depression. You have Western Europe going into a chronic economic depression. If you're India or South America or Africa, where do you think your future prosperity is going to lie? Is it going to lie with trade and investment in a country that's going into depression, that wants really to take over your economy? Or is it going to lie with a part of the world that is growing? China and Eurasia, you're part of the world. And your part of the world looks like it can grow. It doesn't have to shrink. It doesn't have to starve itself by debt. It can make its own rules, and it doesn't need US dollars to do its trade. India now has already arranged to do your trade with Russia in rubles and each other's currency. And that can be a model for how Eurasia works. The countries can all deal with each other's currency, mutual trade investment for mutual gain, and the world doesn't need the United States anymore. Well, the United States response is, well, we'll isolate you. We'll do sanctions on you. We won't let you buy American exports anymore. We won't trade with you. And all you can say is, thank heavens, we don't need to trade with you. We can trade with each other because there's nothing you're producing anymore. America is deindustrialized itself. There's nothing it can do except militarily drop the atom bomb, and that's really not going to solve anything. So it looks to me like India, Pakistan, the whole South Asia is going to be working with the rest of Eurasia to go forward into a kind of socialist development. Capitalism was expected to develop into socialism. That didn't happen in America or Europe. It began to happen in India when your 5-year plan under Mahalanobis was basically based on volume 3 of Capital, and India has a very good planning history that it can certainly subsidize its own industry, its own agriculture, its own tax system without following the junk economics that's taught in American economic universities.
Right. I mean, the problem, however, a country like India is that it is going in the same direction of the Bretton Woods sort of Washington consensus. I mean, at least that's definitely true since the 1991. Literally everything that you said, I mean, things that you spoke about, Russia, for instance, I mean, there was a law that came up called as the FRBM, Financial Responsibility and Budget Management, which was like bringing a cap on the amount of money to be spent by government, and it's like an austerity.
Right.
And there is now a department in the Ministry of Finance called as DIPAM, which is basically a department for privatization. I mean, this was unthinkable in countries like India. Now they go to every business club and advertise that we have set up a different department for privatizations. And on debt, for instance, I mean, you would cringe, but this is true that while lakhs of crores of rupees are just written off for billionaires, and India has the third largest billionaires in the world, but every time there is a sort of couple $100,000 debt rupees debt write-off for literally millions of farmers, there is a huge brouhaha about, oh, this is leading to a very bad management of economy, and already peasants and farmers, they don't know how to run their finances and stuff like that. So I mean, that kind of hope is very difficult to emerge from, at least places like India. I mean, you can think of Brazil and with the pink ties, some sort of progressive governments in Latin America, but in places like Pakistan, not as much for Bangladesh, but definitely not Pakistan and India at the time. But Michael Hudson, thank you very much.
It's good to be here.